research studies that we've been conducting here at Columbia. I'm Peter Coleman, and I am on faculty here at the university, and I direct the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, which is where I'm seated right now. And also, I'm on faculty at the Earth Institute and executive direct the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity there. With Lubita Chapman and Karen LaRose and various other members of our team, we've been conducting research for the last 2 years, I believe. And many of you, some of you participated in some of this research in the last several months, and so we're going to report on the findings of that. But we thought we'd start by giving you some background. Drew Pham is here, and he is helping us coordinate the logistics of the webinar. So what I'll probably do is talk for about 20 minutes or so about the project that we've been doing, and then we'll take questions. And I think you'll be able to type your questions in, and I'll then, at the conclusion of the presentation, read the questions and respond to them in the order that they come in. So thank you all for your time today. And thank you all for those of you that participated in the study. So I need to figure out how to advance this. There we go. Okay. So this study was inspired by some work that was happening at the UN. In 2008, the UN Security Council started to take mediation and the settlement of disputes in the international domain through mediation more seriously. And so they convened a high-level meeting in 2008, and they started a process of really exploring and examining the processes that the UN mediators were involved in. And then on July 11th, 2011, the General Assembly passed a resolution on strengthening the role of mediation in peaceful settlement of disputes. At that time, the UN contacted the center and asked me to become involved in helping them, first of all, put together an academic advisory council for this process, and then being involved in what was really the first attempt to create a set of international guidelines for the effective implementation of mediation in the international domain. So I did get involved at that time, and our research group here took that invitation seriously, and we contributed to these guidelines by reading them over and giving them some feedback from an academic perspective. But we also took a deep dive at that time into the science of mediation. So we started to look carefully at what was empirical research finding in the study of mediation that would be particularly useful or practical to either envoys or UN mediators and the standby mediation team who were going out into the field and implementing. And what we found was that the research there was a lot of research, but it was sort of all over the place. And there was research on kind of mediator style and decision making at the kind of micro level, and then there were macro level case studies and everything in between. But there wasn't really what we would call a coherent theoretical model or conceptual model of mediation that kind of helped us connect the dots. And one of the most glaring gaps was articulated by James Wall in his 2012 review of mediation scholarship. And he said the literature from the past decade, as that from the preceding years, indicates that mediators have about 100 different techniques to choose from. And while this is often, this bountiful array is often overlapping and sometimes very similar strategies, allows for thorough description of what's available, it can also basically get in our way of advancing knowledge through research. Specifically, they said, faced with so many options as a mediator for what to do, scholars haven't been able to identify what are the major causes of different strategies that mediators use, other than their style preferences, and what are the major impacts of using different styles and different strategies in mediation. So we set out in this multi-year project to try to build off of the research that had already been done, but somewhere start to synthesize it in a useful and practical way for mediators. And that's what I want to talk about. So we started with the literature. We did a pretty extensive literature search. We looked at a lot of different kinds of meta models, theory models, and then empirical studies that had been done, some in the lab, some was more survey research. But we were trying to identify what we thought the research said were the most important conditions that affected what mediators did, why they used different strategies in different situations. And so we found this, which is a table of all of the factors that we identified in all of this research. And some of it were different characteristics of the mediators themselves, some were different characteristics of the disputants, differences in the kinds of conflicts that people faced, aspects of the mediation context itself or the broader social context, cultural context, and then the various different strategies mediators employed and outcomes. So again, the research was rich, they were covering a lot of ground, but it was still hard to get a sense of, given all of this, what fundamentally matters. Like, what are differences in situations, complex situations that mediators face that really determine whether they'll use, for example, a more facilitative strategy or a more evaluative strategy, or whether they're more directive or non-directive. You know, what are the conditions that are conducive to those kinds of behavioral differences? So we took all of these variables and we conducted a study with 149 experienced mediators. You might have been some of them. And these mediators, again, were in different areas. Some of them were international mediators. Most of them were domestic mediators, some family mediation, some community mediation, some court mediation. So they were eclectic, some in business. But we were interested, again, in, basically asked them to tell us the story of the last mediation that they conducted. And then we gave them this set of scales and said, we want you to now basically describe the mediation along these different dimensions. And the dimensions, again, were these different characteristics of the mediator, the disputants, the conflict, and the context. And then to tell us what happened, what did you do in the mediation, and how did it turn out? So from that study, we were able to, through sort of factor analysis and looking at all the items, find that there were sort of 4 things that the mediators were telling us, which are different characteristics of mediation situations that really mattered, that really affected their choices and behaviors and strategies. And these 4 things are here. It was the level of intensity of the conflict. Is it a highly intense, difficult, contentious dynamic in the room, or is it more low intensity? Are the relationships between the parties more cooperative? Do they share similarities and connections, or they're more purely competitive? Is the context itself constraining? Are there legal or cultural demands, constraints in the context which really limit what a mediator can do? Or is it a more flexible context where mediators can try different options? And then the degree to which the issues and the processes themselves were on the table. They felt like people were being explicit and covert about them. Overt about them. Were they kind of explicit? Or were they more covert processes? Were there things happening that they felt like people weren't being able to be honest about or candid about, and so they needed to take a different tack? So these were the 4 conditions in mediations that the 149 experts said to us really affected whether I would use one strategy or another. Now, of course, these 4 things don't happen independently. They kind of happen in interaction with each other. So they basically lent themselves to a kind of crude conceptual model looking at how each of these 4 things interact with the other 3. And the model looks like this. My students and my colleagues hate this model because it looks highly complex and inaccessible. But it's basically saying 4 things come together to create situation types that really affect what mediators do. And those situation types are these 16 different situation types. So theoretically, if you're highly cooperative, and if it's a low intensity conflict, and if the situation is relatively unconstrained and the issues are covert, then you're up in the kind of higher left-hand corner there. And your role as a mediator is more of a friend. You have kind of low concern. You're just exploring what's hidden, but you know that they have common ground, etc. So there's a certain sort of role associated with that type of situation, and a certain kind of strategy that lends itself. So this table, which is complicated, says that there are theoretically these like 16 different kinds of situations and roles and therefore strategies that mediators use. So that was our kind of first takeaway from this first study. But we wanted to say, well, do all of these differences matter? So we then did a series of focus groups with mediators that allowed us to say, are some of these situational differences more important than others? And are there particular roles or particular strategies that are much more common than these 16? In other words, can we simplify the model? So through a series of focus groups, we did, I think, a half dozen focus groups and attempted to simplify the model and understand what particular strategies in mediation are associated with particularly different kinds of situation types. And what I'm going to walk you through is that model. And the good news is it was simplified, and there were some things that mattered more than others. So in this, what we call adaptive mediation model, in other words, mediation strategies that are more adaptive to changing situation or really different kinds of situations. What seemed to matter first was, of course, the intensity, right? Are you in a room with people screaming at each other and threatening each other, or worse? Or are you in a context that was sort of more low intensity? And so in the conditions that are more high intensity, difficult conflicts, contentious conflicts, the role we identified was sort of the one of the medic. This is the person that has to basically, as one mediator said, it's like when you encounter a car accident, if there's a victim there, you have to stop the bleeding. First step is stop the bleeding. So if you're in potentially violent or particularly contentious space, you need to sort of manage that, lessen the intensity in order to be able to move on. If you can't, then typically people will end the mediation because it's just not conducive. It's not a condition that's conducive to mediation. So, but they'll use things like being more directive and being sort of having their presence be stronger and controlling the process and managing emotions more directly. They use those strategies to try to basically bring the intensity down, and then if they can do that, then they tend to use a more what we call standard mediation model. And this is what most of you are probably trained in. It's more of a settlement orientation model. It's trying to be less intrusive in the process, but open dialogue, stand back, allow the participants to have their own conversation if possible, be less judgmental, that kind of thing. So ideally, if you can manage the intensity, people move to this kind of default. But again, as we said, these other aspects of the situation also matter. So in asking what else is relevant, we would say, well, what is the quality of the context? Is the situation particularly constrained? So if it is, then people kind of move away from the standard mediation model and move toward more of what we would call the fixer. These are the situations where you sort of have to go in and basically increase control over the situation and possibly efficiency. So if you have time constraints, if there are attorneys in the room and they're charging and so that's costing a lot of money, or if there are other constraints, legal constraints that you have to work within, again, the role of the mediator moves towards how do we either change the nature of the situation or make clear that what the limitations are so that you can work within them. So increased preparation, being more directive, being explicit about what the constraints are, and then motivating people, maybe lowering their aspirations if it's a time constraint. So it really is trying to manage those issues, which in some ways moves you away from the standard model into this subcategory of strategies, strategy and tactics that are necessary. And if you can, again, free things up, buy more time, lessen the constraints, then you may move back to a more standard mediation model. But again, dealing with those constraints matter. Another component is, again, the relationship. Are you dealing with people that have a history of getting along and they've just hit a bump on the road, and so there's a pretty strong sense of cooperation and legality, or are these highly competitive, are the issues and the relationships highly competitive? And as many of you know, mediation assumes that there's, probably some degree of both, but you're going to try to move people into a more cooperative framework that is a standard approach. But if you find in the negotiations and mediation process itself that this is a highly competitive relationship, then, again, the strategy shifts to what we call the referee. It really is a strategy where you move into kind of more zero-sum bargaining. You're facilitating the fair and efficient settlement around more zero-sum negotiations around the tasks, the issues, the agreements, the contract. You probably are paying less attention to the relational dynamics and the emotional dynamics, but again, more attention to how do we try to help them negotiate a fair deal given the trade-offs and given the more competitive nature of the issues. So that, again, is a different type of strategy than the more kind of standard win-win cooperative strategy. And so it's a different emphasis. And people, again, may have to navigate both of these if they find that there's some issues that are more common, where there's more common ground, other issues that are purely win-lose. You may have to sort of do both of those. And that's part of the adaptive character of this, is your ability to, negotiate or facilitate a more competitive negotiation with some issues, and with other issues trying to keep a more collaborative framework. And then the final component that we saw as necessary is, are there issues that are covert? Are there hidden issues? Are there things that people aren't talking about, are comfortable talking about? And if those are assessed as central and important, then again, people need to kind of move off the standard model and take more of a role of what we call the therapist, which is to kind of probe more deeply, more carefully. So typically, people may caucus. They may feel like if people are alone, they'll be more inclined to open up. They'll probe more deeply, inquire as to, are there other things I should know about here? And they may start to coach the parties. So there are, again, it's a different orientation if that's assessed as necessary. And if those things can come out and then can be discussed more openly, you might move back into the more standard approach. But you do need to sort of deal with these things, unearth them, and see if it's possible to have a conversation, a more explicit conversation at the table with them. So that, in general, is our approach to what we call adaptive mediation. It is realizing that some aspects of situations matter more than others, and particularly high, low intensity. And so if you're in high intensity, that's the first question. And if not, most of us move back to our standard training, unless you're in a highly competitive relationship that you're helping mediate. You find that there are covert issues. You find that there are high constraints of some type that you have to navigate. And then you really need to kind of shift into these different roles and manage those challenges in order to ultimately get back to more standard forms of mediation. So we ran the series of focus groups. That's the model that came out of that. And then the study that you participated in, many of you, was this survey study that we asked you to engage with us in. And 76 of you participated, and we were really trying to clarify, given these situations that we've identified, these 5 different situations, what do people really do? So it allowed us to say, all right, here's a situation type. What are the kinds of behaviors and strategies you will use in that situation type? And I think we, I can't remember how many, well, we had multiple scenarios, but how many behaviors? It was something like 72 behaviors, 75 behaviors. So there was a large group of behaviors you chose from. But we were trying to just drill down more specifically and say, in these different situations, what matters, right? So what we found was a better sense of what we call the standard canon of mediator behaviors, being unbiased and brainstorming and checking your assumptions with the disputants, summarizing, encouraging self-reflection. All of these things were very common as the kind of standard canon. What was less canon was telling stories or encouraging, telling the parties basically how to respond, or moving into arbitration. Those were those are significantly least common tactics. But as you see here, being unobtrusive, reward and encourage constructiveness, all of these use humor if necessary or if useful. All of these were part of the basic canon that we found in sort of standard situations. But those differed from, again, these high-intensity situations where people's priority was to create a safe atmosphere, manage more difficult parties, be as kind of present as possible, communicate your presence, monitor nonverbals carefully, provide structure and break time, and try to work the relationships and move into the history of things. So it was a different set of tactics necessary and emphasized in these more high-intensity situations. Similarly, with the, we will, by the way, I think, make these PowerPoints available. So I'm going through them fairly quickly to give you an overview, but we'll make those available, and we also are writing the findings of the study up, and we'll make that available as well. But in these situations of high constraints, what again, the sort of fixer role does is stressing the importance of confidentiality, communicating what the constraints are, and then helping parties sort of save face and keep them at the table, and et cetera. Provides clear structure. These things are particularly important tactics used in situations of high constraints. In highly competitive situations where the relationship is clearly competitive, again, providing clear structure, encouraging distributed bargaining and trade-offs and compromises, and helping them identify what those might be, but also helping them save face, managing expectations, et cetera. More direct control of the process, managing difficult parties. These were the tactics that mediators said were most common in the more highly competitive types of situations. And then finally, when mediators sensed that there was something covert, caucusing, stressing confidentiality, that they can be mediators can be trusted, conducting an exploration of the conflict, interrogating, fact-finding, even starting to explore possibilities for apologies, forgiveness, stating the hidden issues. So a lot of those kinds of tactics that are less common in the standard canon of mediation behaviors, but are necessary when you're trying to probe and understand what is hidden or implicit in the conversation. So what all of this suggests is that, unlike how many of us are trained, I was trained as a community mediator here in New York City, we were usually trained with a kind of set of problem-solving skills, which were trying to encourage people to move in a more cooperative direction and try to find, win-win, mutually satisfying solutions. And others have started to write about, well, there are very different kinds of mediation that takes place. Sometimes it really is brokering a purely competitive dynamic. Sometimes it is trying to manage more high-intensity situations, et cetera. So what we've found is, again, that no one of those situations matters. What matters is your capacity to understand what is the situation I'm facing and what is an approach that will help here, perhaps move it to the conditions where we can apply our basic training, or assess that this is not appropriate for mediation and we need to kind of end it and refer it out. So that's the idea of adaptivity, is being able to read these important differences in different situations and then using tactics and strategies that work given what you're faced with then. We've done research, we and others have done research on adaptivity in negotiations and found that, basically more adaptive orientations to mediation and negotiation help. They help people in their work life. They tend to feel more satisfied at work, have better emotional health. But there's also been in mediation some research that has looked at higher levels of efficacy and satisfaction when mediators are more flexible and use different strategies. Van der Voort and Yuma have found that as well, in combining different kinds of conflict resolution styles. So there's a fair amount of other research in the international domain by Zartman and Rubin, but also in the domestic domain as well, that shows that adaptivity, your capacity to use different strategies, matters. What we've added to this literature is that there are some things that being adaptive on that matter more than others. And the four dimensions that we talked about, high intensity, high constraints, highly competitive, or hidden issues, very important covert issues, are those characteristics of situations that really matter and for which you need to have sort of different strategies available to yourself. So what we're doing at this point is, of course, writing up the findings from the study that many of you participated in, and as we said, we'll be happy to share those. But the plan now is to move on and to develop what we would call an adaptive mediator assessment. And so it will be basically, and this is the process of the next study that we're launching. It will be basically presenting mediators such as yourself with a variety of different scenarios, situations, and saying, in this situation, what do you think is the best approach to take? And then we'll show you these different roles and strategies and see if people are able and comfortable in reading the situational differences that they're presented with, and then responding in ways that fit, that work with that situation. Or are people particularly comfortable doing kind of standard mediation, but not particularly comfortable when issues are covert and requires a more kind of therapeutic orientation, or when issues are high intensity? And that will give you some sense of either mediation scenarios to avoid in your work, or the kinds of competencies that you want to build on in order to enhance your capacity to be more adaptive and ultimately what we believe is more effective. So that's basically our story. We're moving on to the creation of these assessments. We hope to have those done probably sometime this summer to begin to pilot. And then from that, we'll begin to develop a set of mediation trainings that emphasize not just the core canon of mediation, but the importance of these different conditions and the tactics and strategies associated with being more effective when those situations present themselves. That is our model. The takeaway is, again, that we're working with both science, so using existing research, and then conducting experiments, surveys, focus groups, to use the scientific method to try to develop this more, what we hope is comprehensive but useful theory and model of mediation. But we're also really privileging people like you. We're privileging the practitioners' expertise and their information and their insights and instincts. And so we're trying to combine both the scientific method with the information that you all have shared. And it does have implications for, we believe, how effective mediations are, how sustainable the agreements are, for the kinds of competencies that you want to train mediators in beyond this standard canon. What are the other strategies and skills, and the capacity to use different strategies and skills that are necessary to be more effective. And it has implications for, again, what mediators are comfortable, what kinds of mediations you might be more and less comfortable with, and the kinds of competencies that you might want to build, and how we may do research on that. So that is our story. That is an overview in 28 minutes of what we've done so far and where we plan to go. And now I'm happy to answer any questions. And these are the questions?
Yes, this is where people can enter questions in the chat function. Everyone should have access to this. And if you type in your question and press enter, it should send the question to us, and then we'll read the question and respond.
So one question that came was, is there a way that they can download the PowerPoints? We will figure out how to
we can make them available.
I guess we could probably just email them out to people that participated. So we're happy to do that. So the question is, are there other questions about the study, the research, the next steps, anything we can answer? Yes, another question came in here. So the question is, it's one thing to explore what mediators actually do / say we do. At some point, will these data explorations be linked with, one, actual settlement rates, and or two, how well those settlements actually last? It's one thing to settle a dispute, and another question whether that settlement actually sticks and doesn't end up challenged in a court. This is particularly an issue for divorce mediations. Yes, so the answer is yes. So what we plan to do and hope to extend into is, once we have the assessments and the ability to basically assess levels of adaptivity of mediators, We're going to start to work, we believe, with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services through Josh Flax, who's at the Kennedy School, to help use these adaptive mediation assessments for their mediators, to start to do some trainings around them, and then to see the impact of both the assessment, like how adaptive mediators are, and the trainings, and looking at their evaluations of their caseload. So that will be our first step of taking the assessment into the field. But we also hope to work with community mediators and other mediators as well to see if the adaptivity assessment does predict more sustainability of agreements and more efficacy of agreements. So the answer to that is yes. Let's see, there are other questions. Just to confirm, there's not a way for us to participate in the audio. I think that's right.
No, you can. We can participate in audio if you prefer. All they would have to do is unmute. So next to.
I think I'd rather just because there are a series of questions here. Let me go through the written questions, and then if we have time, we can go to audio. So somebody said the research seems to examine what is typically done in the various contexts. To what extent does it address what is preferable to do in the various contexts? So again, what we did in both the focus groups is ask people, right, principally, what do they do in those situations? What are the strategies that I believe are most effective, right, Aaron? Yes, right. So it's a combination of both. It is what do you feel works in these situations most? So it is a combination of what people report doing, but also to some degree what they report as being effective in those situations. The next question is, what inspired or motivated the study? What is the goal? Is it primarily to inform mediator methods and training? So I'm not sure, this is from Loretta, I'm not sure if you caught the beginning of the presentation, but what inspired this was the United Nations asking academics, what is research that you feel is practical and useful? And so we did go into the research to see, are there recommendations that academics can offer from research that are useful for practitioners on the ground in terms of what are the different situations that require different strategies and what are the characteristics of those situations. So that's why we launched this in the first place. And so, yeah, ultimately it is about offering a model of mediation that is more eclectic than one size fits all, that really talks about key differences in situations and key strategies that help you more effectively manage those situations that will have implications for assessment and training of mediators ultimately. So it does have practical, our goals are ultimately practical, but we're trying to use the scientific method to move us in that direction. By the way, thanks to this research, it's very interesting. You're welcome. Somebody said, I think this is a helpful additional lens through which to look at mediation work and with which to think about mediator training. Very good. Or to evaluate mediation in different settings and conflict. I guess that's a question. So, or to evaluate mediation in different settings, conflict scenarios. I think it's a question. If it is a question, so as you know, as mediators, as practicing mediators, sometimes you enter a conflict, you get a read on it, you start to work with it, and then either the dynamics change or you start to realize that you misread it, and it's actually something hidden that's come out, and that changes the whole dynamic. So to some degree, you may need to be adaptive in the context of one mediation in an hour. You may start to get a read that there are actually different things happening here than I first had a sense of. But it also might be that, again, a mediation takes place over several sessions and things change, or you may be dealing with case one in the morning and then in the afternoon go to a different case that is radically different, in which case you need to be able to kind of switch and use different kinds of strategies. Okay. Someone says, I'm not seeing others' questions in the chat, tracking only my own. I'm not sure why that is, but I'll read them. Tim says, I'm thinking it might be helpful not to call this a model of mediation because that will tend to box it as exclusive. This was one of the problems that arose with the transformative model. Could talk about this more if we weren't only using written chat, right? Yes. So that's fair enough. I mean, it is what we call an adaptive model because it is responding to changes in the situation that are necessary to respond to it with strategies that fit. So like Darwin suggested, the world evolves and changes, and those of us that can evolve with it and employ survival strategies that fit are more likely to survive. I think the same is probably true for mediators. So it is a model of sorts, but I take your point that we may want to be careful about how we characterize this and not make it exclusive, because the truth is it's an inclusive model of various different kinds of strategies that are used in different kinds of situations. How do you think these study findings impact online mediation scenarios? Really good question. No idea is the answer. That it's not something we've studied carefully or thought about systematically yet. I presume it will have some implications for what mediators do, but again, what you do in a high intensity online mediation, what you do when there are covert issues online, will be a very different set of strategies, and we need to work with people that are very familiar with that modality in order to better understand how to make recommendations. Someone says, Dave said, to adapt effectively, I first need to recognize what kind of situation I am in. How good are mediators at assessing what kind of situations that they find themselves in? Yeah, that's one of our main points is, can you read either nature of the situation or important changes that have occurred as the situation evolves? And that's one of the things our assessment will be able to check is, do people read these differences and respond in different ways that fit or not? Someone said, yes, it's inclusive. I agree, Tim. So those are the questions that we've received. If there are other questions, we're happy to entertain them.
Do you want to turn audio on?
Yeah, we can. Why don't we turn the audio on and give people a chance to talk?
You might hear a lot of different sounds.
Yeah, so we can't do this unless we. So if you're speaking, you can unmute your mic. But if you're just listening, you'll need to mute it if we're going to turn the volume on. Otherwise, we'll get all things. So we will take the mute off, but people, if you're not speaking, should mute your microphone. Okay?
If I wanted to speak now, is this working? This is Tim Hicks.
Okay, so I think, can we turn the volume back up? Okay, so does anybody want to ask a question?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're a little light, but we can hear you.
This is just a test, but I think we're all unmuted. This is Steve Gitman.
Okay.
So, not sure where to go again, but I'll try talking and interrupt me if you need to. One interesting thing that I'm thinking about, and kind of a broad question, is the movement within a mediation as dynamics change. As one example, if one is being more directive at one point in a mediation because of the conditions that you've discussed, and then things begin to shift, does that directive orientation inhibit a shift to a more facilitative role? To put it more simply than is satisfactory, but maybe you get my idea.
Yeah, sure. I think you're right that there is always a dynamic between what the mediator is doing and what the disputants are doing. It's not a one-way street. And if you come in really particularly strong at some point, that may have an impact on the other dynamics that unfold. But, so yes, there is a degree of artistry in this and sort of sensitivity to what's happening. And if you use more extreme measures, they may, like you start to threaten ending the mediation, they may have implications for what people are willing and able to say. But again, I think what we're offering is a guideline. Okay. If you see changes in some of these basic dynamics from high to low intensity or from what you thought were kind of overt issues to more covert issues, that you may want to move into a different strategy. You might find that the strategy just used had a surprising effect. Maybe you started to try to unpack things that were hidden, and that helped, that contribute to escalating things. So you'd have to shift to that. So certainly being adaptive is going to be kind of online. It's going to be alive, and it's going to require, the kind of observation skills and adaptive skills that I think good mediators oftentimes have. What we offer here, I think, is really just a set of guidelines to say, well, what are the situational differences that most mediators say matter most in terms of shifting your strategy? But yes, shifting your strategy may have implications for what the disputants do. We oftentimes hope that they will, right?
You're offering a framework within which to understand what's happening.
To understand and respond. I think to some degree you want to understand when important differences have presented themselves and realize that you probably need to back off of some tactics and maybe rely more heavily on others. So it is a framework for understanding, but also a framework for, it to some degree is prescriptive, depending on how accurately you're reading the situation and how extreme these differences are that present themselves.
Understood.
Loretta asked, to what extent is the ability to read scenarios intuitive? I think that's a really good question. It is sort of the issue of emotional intelligence, and some of us, I think people, particularly people born in chaotic homes, alcoholic homes, do tend to be very other-oriented, very sensitive to others, so predisposed to read those differences. But I also think that these are competencies that can be trained. That mediators, particularly if we can be clear about what the differences are that they should be on the lookout for, it can transcend intuition and move into competencies, practice people can develop. Any other questions that come to mind? People that were muted, now they're, or maybe you muted yourself. Somebody said, Loretta asked, how do these study findings affect those who had experienced trauma, especially in childhood, where studies have shown brain changes in responses to trauma? So I guess the question is in reference to the disputants, dealing with traumatized disputants. I guess that's what the question is. Maybe clarify it. Again, mediation, as you all know, is not mentioned for everything. And it does assume rationality, some degrees. It does presume some kind of normative context where people aren't threatening to kill each other. There are definitely limits to what when mediation is a useful intervention. With highly traumatized populations, mediation may not be the right environment. It's not a sufficiently safe or therapeutic environment to really get to the kinds of dynamics and issues that need to be case, you may need to refer people out. That's the question about the disputants and their needs. Again, mediation can be useful in the context of a relationship to unearth some of that, but certainly isn't useful for treating. It isn't particularly oriented towards treating trauma. Dave asked, it would be interesting to have actors do a simulated conflict and see how various mediators adapt to the context. Examine perhaps a dozen mediators. So that's a good idea. That is something we've discussed here. So one way to test the model would be through experiments. In experiments, we would bring in mediators and give them, sort of put them in different situations, or put them in other situations, and see if they have these capacities to, shift. And see if so we have talked about that first. Any other questions? Sounds like people are typing. I'm not sure if that's a question yet. So it's a question. Dimensions to mediator training. As I see it, there's not one training for the mediator. Rather, there are a number of angles we must come at the question of what is mediation and what are the skills that are useful. We agree that we think it's a useful approach too. Again, we've been learning a lot from both other research that's been done as well as practitioners have been telling us. And I suspect that probably expert mediators intuitively understand more effective in more types of situations. Okay. Somebody said the speaker's audio is going in and out. I apologize to hear that. Michelle says it's hard to hear. I don't know why that is. Oh, am I rocking? That's probably me. Yes, I move. I tend to move when I speak. I apologize for that. It might help if I lean forward and stay in there and stop moving. Okay, I will do that.
Thank you.
It says remind us to mute mics when typing. Unmuted when typing. That's why. Aha, it's not my rocking. All right. Any other questions, concerns, ideas that you want to put forward?
Don't hear any typing.
Yeah, I don't hear any typing. That seems to indicate that people have run the course. Well, so we are happy to entertain questions after this. You're welcome to email us questions. I know Levita sent out, somebody sent out an email yesterday with details. You can respond to that if you have subsequent questions. But thank you for your time, and thank you for participating with us in this mediation. We will continue this research through different channels, and probably be reaching out to you in the near future to participate again and to engage some of your colleagues in participating. So thank you. Loretta says, thank you so much. This is informative. If we have any assistance in future studies, feel free. We will. Rochelle says, thank you. Tim says, good work. Thank you all. Take care. Okay.